All right, so in this week's video, we are going to be talking about worship, the worship experience in the place of the sanctuary, are very sacred places for any church for more than one reason. They're sacred in, of course, the religious sense. It's a special, set apart, sacred things we do, things we say, the way we behave, the history they have. And it's where we come to commune with God. We know God is everywhere in this world, but for some reason we feel the presence of God more so when we're in this sacred space of the sanctuary, especially during the sacred time of worship. But worship in the sanctuary are sacred for another reason. They're sacred in a very real sense. Any new pastor who's been around the block for quite some time now, who's entered a new parish, know that there is one eternal truth that exists in that new church. Do not mess with the worship service. What the congregation does and how they do it, it's sacred to that community. Those things may not have been sacred to my past church or any church I serve. They may not be sacred to me, but they are sacred to the people of this congregation, and that is to be respected. So don't mess with the sanctuary. Don't mess with that sacred space. Don't move the chairs. The placement of the chairs even is sacred to the community who placed those chairs. So with all this said, we're going to talk about changing worship, the changing of the sacred space, changing the sanctuary. Now, before you grab your pitchforks and your torches, know that there's a reason why I began the video talking about how sacred worship is in every way. I get it. I understand. I want you to hear that and to know that I mean it. I get it and I understand. But at the same time, as your new pastor, I have been given somewhat of an impossible task. I need to help this church create a knock your socks off worship experience. But I also know it's generally the rule in all congregations that people get very upset when you change anything in the worship service. So how do you improve the worship experience without changing the worship experience? The sign of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. If we want to take our worship experience to the next level, then we do need to make some changes. Now, before the anxiety levels get too high, I need to say that Windermere has an incredible worship service. We are not talking about making major dramatic changes. We're simply talking about tweaking the service we all know and love and want to keep. But even small changes are often met with resistance. And I'm a strong believer in open dialogue. Just communicate the situation with the whole congregation as we're doing right now. And together, let's deal with the situation as mature adults. Once we can see what the situation is, then how do we navigate the waters to get the best results? When we're faced with a dilemma and many different opinions of a congregation, we don't have to conclude with a win-lose outcome. We can get creative and create a win-win situation that works for everyone. But at the same time, in order to create this win-win situation, we have to be at least ready to bend a little bit. Now, with all this build up, let's talk about the actual worship service. So I'll begin with this bold statement. Let's face it, Windermere Union Church does not even have an hour-long worship service. We have a 30-minute town hall meeting followed by a sermon. Now, I know for many people in this church, that first 30-minute town hall meeting is more sacred than the sermon itself. When people talk about how can we make sure that worship ends within the hour, people always suggest first a shorter sermon. They do not suggest shortening the town hall meeting. This clearly shows where the priorities lie. Again, before anxiety levels get too high, how are we doing? Just breathe. Does anyone need a paper bag to breathe into? Just stick with me a little longer and we'll get through this. It's going to be okay. All right, back to changing worship. The first half hour of worship is clearly sacred to this congregation, and perhaps for some more sacred than the second 30 minutes of actual worship time. So we need to preserve this first 30-minute sacred space, the concerns, the celebrations, as well as the passing of the peace. They should all remain a very sacred time in our worship service because they are sacred to you, the Windermere Union Church. But can we streamline this portion of the service? First of all, there's nothing sacred about announcements. There are multiple ways, far more effective, of communicating the Sunday morning announcements. This is one element of the worship that I would propose. It's gone. With that said, let's begin with concerns. Concerns should be a part of worship because they are sacred to this congregation. Many people find a great deal of value in having the concerns being part of the worship experience. We do have two issues we need to address, so this is where the conversation with adults begins. If we're going to keep these concerns in worship, we need to address these two concerns. First, how do we contain the concerns to a reasonable time frame in worship? And then second, and far more important, is the privacy issue. Hospitals follow a HIPAA law for a reason. And it's not just for the sake of following the rules and regulations and HIPAA laws. It's about the dignity and respect of the person that we are praying for. Most of the concerns that seem to be lifted up on Sunday morning are people airing personal information about other people. Do we know that these other people wanted their personal information shared publicly? And not only was this information shared with our entire congregation, it was also live streamed to the world, where that information will now live forever on the internet. If I had a vasectomy last week, I may not have wanted that known to the entire congregation. I certainly didn't want that information posted on the internet by someone else, namely the church who's live streaming that information. So here's the challenge. How do we keep this sacred time of concerns in the worship experience while containing the time it takes and keeping the confidentiality of others? I would propose that we create multiple channels where the church members can communicate their concerns to the Stevens ministers in our church. On our website, we can create an online prayer page. It's already been talked about with the tech team. This page can have a form that people can fill out with their prayer request. And of course, people can also call, email the church, the pastor, another Stephen minister, any of them. Then during the worship experience, one of the Stephen ministers can come to the lectern and share the concerns that people have expressed in the church. So they all still get shared. This way, the Stephen minister can not only streamline by just saying them one after the other, they can also use discretion in the words they choose to talk about these concerns. So, for example, if it was reported to the church office that I had a vasectomy last week, then the Stephen minister, when they're there on Sunday morning, lifting it up in prayer to the whole congregation and to the entire world where it will rest forever, they can simply say, we pray for Pastor Brad and his healing. Or they might go on to even say, Pastor Brad had a minor procedure this week and we pray for his continued healing. Having one person read the concerns will make them go quicker. It'll also respect people's privacy and the words we choose when we share their concerns. With the celebrations in worship, that goes concerns and celebrations. With the celebrations in worship, people are most often lifting up their own celebration. Concerns, we're spilling the beans on everyone else's life. And we're not spilling the beans on our own life, we're spilling the beans on other people's lives. But when it comes to celebrations, we share our own celebrations, and we're more than happy to share the good stuff in our life, but not the bad. So these tend to go quicker, and there's less of a privacy concern because the person sharing it is themselves. So this brings us to the passing of the peace. There's no real issue with the celebrations. The beloved passing of the peace. Well, this is a beautiful time in the worship experience. I see no reason why it can't continue as it always continued. Just much quicker than it's always continued. So we need to shorten that time down. I've already begun to strategically design the worship service in such a way that we will end in 2 minutes. Now we're not quite there yet, but trust me, we'll get there. We're going to end in 2 minutes. We have before and after church to have those lengthy discussions. The passing of the peace should be sharing quick words of love and not retelling the plot of the movie that you saw last night. With the proposed changes I've mentioned so far in the worship service is remaining basically the same as it's always remained, we've just tweaked a few things here and there. So the next thing to address in the worship experience is the music. First of all, I think the music has been incredible. We will continue to do a little bit of everything. We'll sing hymns, we'll sing contemporary songs, and even a secular song here and there. We are a diverse, multi-generational congregation who have high hopes in attracting young families. So we need to have an all-of-the-above approach when it comes to the music. And I have all the trust in Troy, Brandy, and the rest of the praise band. I've already let them know that the sky is the limit. I want them to be artists, to use their creativity, their talent to the fullest. The most counterproductive thing that anyone can do is to contain an artist in a box. I want to collaborate with the praise team. I want to make the music flow with the theme of the worship experience. I want us to have tight communication with each other. But then I want to step back and let the musicians just dazzle me with their talent. I trust them. I believe that we have some exciting things coming around the corner when it comes to the music program at Windermere Union Church. The next thing in the worship is the children. I'd like to continue including children everywhere, anywhere that we can in the service, the readings, the special music, just anything. Come up with an idea of how to use a child in the service. They're in there. We got a 6-year-old who wants to preach a sermon. I'll give the 6-year-old the pulpit, whatever it takes. Anywhere at any time we can include children in the service, I'm all in. The communion service. That needs 2 stations. This past Sunday when we did communion, it was Palm Sunday. It took us 20 minutes just to get through the communion portion. We did have a higher number in worship because it was Palm Sunday, but we're looking at having higher numbers in the future as being our norm. So I think the twin drive-throughs is something. So really virtually no change. It's just we're going to add another communion station for communion. So now preaching. Well, I've only had one sermon to be able to critique, so we can't really talk too much about it, but I will tell you, I try to keep my sermons to 15 to 20 minutes. We can talk more about the sermons at a later time. One thing I will say, kind of unrelated to the sermons, you'll see that the first Sunday I sat down with my wife. I haven't 100% decided what I'm going to do, but I've had a practice in my past churches, like many churches, the minister sits up on the king's throne up there on the stage For one, I just like being down with the people, just symbolically of what that means, and like sitting with my wife. So that might continue. I might go back up to the stage. Honestly, I don't know. So we can talk about sermons a little bit more at a later time, but I will say during the April 23rd sermon, I will be using the sermon time itself to have a discussion about sermon content. Now, there's a lot to be said about sermon content, but I'm going to be addressing it from at least one angle during that sermon. So it's going to be a sermon about sermon content. We'll get there. We're also going to have an experiment that same Sunday, April 23rd, where we're going to have the congregation participate in the sermon with a 2-minute time of partnering up in groups of 2 or 3, talking about the scripture in the sermon topic. It's going to be a little different, but we'll have fun with it, see how it is going to play out. So the biggest change that really is going to be happening in the worship service, again, keeping the worship service the same, just enhancing what we already have, is we're going to be getting new projectors and possibly the need for new screens mounted on the wall. Now, I just literally, before I made this video, when I was looking for the video or a picture of the sanctuary as my backdrop, I saw a picture of this sanctuary with screens on the wall. So was there an issue? I don't know. I just learned this. I'm talking to you as I just saw the picture. Was there an issue with the screens on the wall? Did people not like them? You really need the screens. The screens are not just there decoratively. The screens are there. They provide reflectivity that's going to reflect the image that's being projected to, so enhancing it. So the paint is absorbing that light and making it worse. So the screens are really a necessity in projecting the image. So, I don't know if it was an aesthetic thing of how it looks, of why there's no screens in the sanctuary. Again, this is new information I just learned as I found an old picture that was very informative to your pastor. But nonetheless, we need to improve that direly. So we are going to be getting new screens, new projectors. We can get the image much brighter. We don't need to cover the windows. With the window situation, we can already get the screens much, much brighter. Once we've improved the media equipment, we'll begin to use much more engaging media throughout the worship experience, which will just kind of add a level of enhancement to the service, bring another dimension into the service. So again, still, even at this point, if we reflect back over the video, we'll notice that things that I proposed really are not changing the worship experience all that much. We added another station for communion. I'm going to make the image on the screens brighter. We're going to include children, which we always have, and let the music, continue to be awesome. We're, maybe tweaking that concern time a little bit, ignoring the announcement time, whatever it is, shortening the Passion of the Peace, things like that. But still, it's the same time in the worship. We're just tweaking it a little bit. So generally, it's the exact same worship service with a few major enhancements. My big buildup at the beginning of this whole video may have been overdone, saying, but I do know, I know, I've been a minister for a while. These small, tiny tweaks can be a real struggle for those who see this as a sacred time and they struggle with the changes. And I don't want to belittle that or downplay that. I respect that it's going to be a struggle. I understand that, even the smallest of changes. But know that we're trying to enhance something. We're trying to do something great. We're trying to attract young families and young children. And there are certain reasons why we need to do some of this stuff. So I do want to end by saying that I know that worship is sacred. The way we've been doing worship at Windermere Union Church is sacred to you, because for this community, that's the way you worship. I know that the sacred space is sacred to you. Again, I was fear and trepidation. I was saying, oh, did you guys have screens in the sanctuary already and you took them out? I don't know the reason behind this. This is all brand new information to me. Sacred space, people have very high value of it. So I get it. I understand it. I'm trying to walk a very thin line here. We're trying to enhance the worship experience, and we're trying to attract new young families at the same time. So at the same time we're trying to attract the new young families, we're trying to respect the long-standing sacred traditions of this congregation. During my sermon on April 16th, I talked about my sermon on April 23rd. During my sermon on April 16th, we're going to talk about how we can weave the new and the old together in a way that creates something very beautiful. I know this is sacred space. I know that you love the town hall meeting at the beginning as much as the worship and the last half. I know that. We have some goals we're trying to meet, and we can't meet those goals by doing the same thing we've always done, because if we do the same thing we've always done, you'll get the same results you've always had. So we do need to make some changes. Let's work on this together, see if we can get a win-win situation, find something where we keep the value, but also enhance the service at the same time. With that, look forward to my next video.